Welcome back to the Convo Couch, my humans. I am Pasta Jardula.
And I'm Fiorella.
And Jonny Sue is still spinning on the ones and twos. And today we have a great guest.
Ben Norton.
Ben
Norton, who has done a wonderful reporting for the Gray Zone. Specifically, I've been looking a lot at the foreign policy work that you guys do. You're the assistant editor. And you describe yourself as hating a journalist that hates the media, which I can kind of agree with that 100%. Thank you for being here today.
Of course. Thanks for having me. And thanks for covering these issues, because as we'll talk about today, and, you know, the root of my hatred of the media is that the majority of journalists won't touch these issues. And if they do, they'll only touch it with gloves that were approved by the CIA.
Exactly. So let's get right into that. So we've had a lot of people on this show talk about China versus the Western media narrative. And in your own words, though, what's wrong with the U.S. narrative that China is authoritarian? Is there more to this? Because everybody's immediate reaction is China's authoritarian. We have to help the Chinese. We have to help Hong Kong. We have to bring democracy. It's this idea that many people on the left also tend to support.
Yeah, well, first of all, we have to interrogate what that question even means, right? A lot of debates are, frankly, what they boil down to is a discussion of the terms, a debate of what the definitions are of the terms. So what does it mean to be authoritarian? That buzzword is thrown around all the time. And it's usually essentially used to mean that if you don't have a leader change power every 4 to 8 years with some kind of ceremonial shift, even if the policies all stay the same, even if the leader and the government actually don't represent the people, that doesn't matter. What matters is that you have a ceremonial shift in the de facto head of state, or at least the symbolic head of state, every periodic time. So according to that definition, the US is a democracy. It's not authoritarian. But everyone around the world can see right now that the US police state is brutalizing protesters, that in U.S. elections, if there is a popular candidate, someone like Bernie Sanders, it's very clearly stolen from them. Everyone just watched them steal the election in broad daylight, the primary election. Yeah. And we're left with a choice between two candidates who are basically identical, especially in this election. I mean, it's pretty insane. And they're both funded by Wall Street. They're both funded by large corporations. One of them is a billionaire. The other one told billionaires that nothing will fundamentally change. So what's incredible is hearing people complain about how China is authoritarian while saying it in the same breath, we have to vote for Joe Biden, giving ammunition to those people who think that the U.S. is somehow a democracy. I would argue that in many ways, we should think of democracy as not just a ceremonial shift in power, but does the government actually represent the people? Does the government actually provide services to the people? Who are the people who are actually governing the society? Is it the politicians who are ostensibly elected to represent people, or is it capital? Is it billionaire oligarchs? Is it the military industrial complex? Is it the unelected shadow intelligence agencies, these spy groups that just basically commit organized crime, but it's under the aegis of the state, so it's okay? And if you look at the context of the U.S., it's a deeply authoritarian society. So it's so wild to me when people complain about China. Look, of course, people have every right to criticize their own government. So, of course, Chinese people have many criticisms of their own government. But the irony is that if you look at polling consistently, and this is independent polling by Western firms, not by firms that are controlled by the Chinese Communist Party, they show that consistently the government in China is quite popular, with support from around 3/4 of the population. Has anyone looked at polling of popularity of the U.S. government? I mean, the last time I checked, Congress has some close to a single-digit approval rating.
Yeah.
There's no trust in the media. There's certainly no trust in the White House, and that's true for Obama and for Trump. The only institution in the U.S. that's trusted is the military, which says a lot about how authoritarian the society is. So we just have to have a more expanded understanding of what it means to have, what it means to be authoritarian. Because if you have an election every 4 years that's rigged, that's stolen, where millions of votes are thrown out, by the way, but if you still have the ceremony of an election every 4 years, that doesn't make you a democracy.
Yeah, and we can tell you
100%.
about elections on this couch over here. That's our area of expertise, and
Yeah.
I don't think we're anything but plutocrats running this country. But let's dive a little bit deeper into this, because a lot of people say it's the humanitarian situation, in particular the Uyghurs. And when you argue about China's independence against these NGOs like the NED, a lot of people will point to those Uyghurs being rehabilitated or reprogrammed or whatnot. And the Western media seems to have this kind of like facade that if you're a Muslim in China, you're going to be jailed of sorts, and not really understand the history of the Uyghurs. Can you dive a little bit more into that, about as far as, the connections with these concentration camps and what they really are, if they are concentration camps, and, what the Uyghurs are all about, and in general, what it is? Because when I look at a lot of stuff online, when I look at Carl Zah, I see Muslims all over China, in East China, West China, all over the place. So can you dive a little bit into that particular narrative? Because the neo-progressives won't let this go.
Absolutely. Well, this is probably the most important piece of ammunition that the U.S. has so far in the new Cold War. And we should, every time we're talking about China, we have to frame it in the context of a new Cold War. That's exactly what's happening right now. And it's a bipartisan war, like basically every war in the U.S., except the class war, which has no support from the political class. But if you look at the speech Mike Pompeo gave a few weeks ago, Mike Pompeo went to it's the Nixon Center, is what it's called. And it's where, and this is a very symbolic speech, because it was Richard Nixon who famously had the opening with China. There was a split, the Sino-Soviet split. It's a long history we don't have time to get into, but the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China had a falling out. And there was a period of political transition. China has changed a lot in the past 60 years, a lot. And we can talk about that. But there was actually a period, this is ironic, where in the 70s and the 80s, there was an alliance between the PRC, China, and the US against the Soviet Union. And this is a period, especially with the rise of Deng Xiaoping, and there's a lot of political transitions. This is after Mao Zedong dies in 1976. It's the end of the Cultural Revolution. And so there's a period there where China and the U.S. team up against the Soviet Union. And that is the beginning of this relationship. And now we're seeing the effective end of that partnership. And we're seeing a process of what people call decoupling. And you actually will even hear some right-wingers in the Trump administration who will use the term economic decoupling. What they mean is delinking the Chinese economy from the U.S. economy, because you can't really hurt the Chinese economy with sanctions without hurting the U.S. economy, because they're so integrated. Right. So we're going through this process of decoupling. And this is something that Steve Bannon was pushing really early on in the Trump administration. And it's something that it's been the long-term trajectory, although it's easier said than done. And anyway, the point is that Mike Pompeo gave this speech, and he gave it in the Nixon Center because in his speech, he framed it saying that he views the Pompeo State Department, which is basically the CIA. We can never forget that Pompeo comes from the CIA. He's also totally a Koch brothers asset. I mean, he's a great example of the best democracy money can buy, right? The Koch brothers totally created him as a political figure. He came out of the military. There was actually a really interesting article in The Nation looking at the West Point Mafia that he was part of, that looks at this kind of mafia, this elite grouping within the U.S. military, specifically within the elite military academies like West Point, that Pompeo comes out of. And there's a really interesting article you should check out in The Nation detailing more of that. But anyway, the point is that Pompeo comes out of the military. He enters right-wing Republican circles. The Koch brothers cultivate him. He becomes head of the CIA. He takes it over to the State Department. And the State Department at this point is a wing of the CIA. I mean, they've always had a very close relationship, but the State Department is pushing regime change around the world, all of these things. Anyway, so this is a lot of context, but the point I'm saying is that we have to understand all of this context in order to understand why the U.S. is so fixated on China, why we keep hearing about the Uyghur situation and all of this propaganda. So Pompeo said that his view is that it was a mistake for Nixon to make this alliance with China, and that now the goal of the U.S. is basically to overthrow the Chinese government. He didn't say that explicitly, but he very heavily implied it, saying that there needs to be an alliance of Western so-called democracies, right, which is probably going to include dictatorships, because Saudi Arabia certainly isn't a democracy, and you never hear them complain about authoritarianism in the most authoritarian country on earth, probably Saudi Arabia. But anyway, the point is that he said that we're going to make this alliance now, and there's going to be a conflict with China to change the government in China. And we've seen many other figures. There was a New York Times op-ed by Niall Ferguson, who is a Harvard right-wing historian, a leading defender of the British Empire. He wrote an article last year, and he said very explicitly, there's a new Cold War with China, and it's good. So that's the context of what's happening. And one of the most powerful weapons of propaganda that the U.S. has in the new Cold War is this idea that they're trying to cultivate that somehow China is like Nazi Germany.
Yeah.
Right.
Which is really wild, because if you looked objectively at any country in the world right now, what would be the country that's most like Nazi Germany? The U.S.
Yeah.
United States. It's not China. But no, if you don't support the new Cold War against China, you're a Nazi. You support concentration camps. That's the tactic that's been created here, and it's very effective, because you can get all of these liberals, you can tug at their heartstrings and say, look, we have to make common cause with the Trump administration, even though we don't like them, even though we don't like Pompeo, we have to make an alliance with them, or like the alliance between AOC and Ted Cruz against the evil Chinese Communist Party.
Yeah.
because they're Nazis.
Yeah.
So that's the larger context, and we can talk more about Xinjiang and the Uyghurs and all of that. But we really have to keep in mind that we're in a new Cold War, and I really think that history books, if the planet survives, I mean, if climate change or the real possibility of a nuclear conflict, if a new world war, if that doesn't destroy civilization, then I think in 50, 100 years, historians are going to look back at this moment and be like, this is the beginning of the new Cold War between the U.S. and not just China, but also Russia.
And a lot of Western media also, just keeping along with the Uyghurs, it says that if you're Muslim in China, you're treated entirely different. Have you seen evidence of that?
Well, there are Muslims all across China, and this is what's also so interesting, is that the Uyghurs are one particular ethnic group in China, and there are multiple ethnic groups in the country, the Han being the main ethnic group. But a lot of Western propaganda likes to portray China as this massive cultural monolith, as if all Chinese people are ethnically the same. There are multiple languages, many dialects. Some of these dialects are totally mutually unintelligible, by the way. They're basically different languages. And then there are different ethnicities. So there are a variety of Muslim groups. The particular group that's gotten all this attention, the Uyghurs, this is a group where the U.S. has a long history, and not just the U.S., but Turkey specifically. These countries have a long history of supporting a separatist movement. And there's been a lot of violence in Xinjiang, which you're never allowed to discuss. There's been a lot of ethnic violence between the Uyghur, and it's not between every Uyghurs. Again, this is an artificial construction where we're supposed to believe that the Chinese government just hates Uyghurs for not being Han Chinese. I mean, there is a problem with extremism in this community, as there is a problem with extremism in the white community in the U.S. of neo-Nazis of shooting people up. I mean, like there are different problems, and it's a very real reality that there are Islamist extremists who have carried out massacres and terror attacks. And what's so funny is seeing the U.S. government, the creator of the so-called war on terror, this country that has terrorized Muslims around the world and inside of its own borders for decades, killing millions of Muslims, over 1 million just in Iraq alone. And then now suddenly the same people who have been carrying out these Islamophobic wars are now crying wolf about a specific Muslim group inside China.
Yeah.
I mean, it's so hypocritical. And this isn't even to mention the fact that, of course, the vast majority of Uyghur Muslims are normal Muslims, like the majority of Muslims in the world. There are over 1 billion Muslims. But it's also a fact that there are tens of thousands, potentially hundreds of thousands of extremist Uyghur Muslims, Salafi jihadists, who have been fighting in Syria. And what's funny is the Associated Press did basically a press release for them, talking about, like, endorsing them and saying that they have this valiant struggle, not mentioning that they're in alliance with Al-Qaeda.
Yeah.
And there's a group in Syria called the Turkestan Islamic Party, which is a close ally of Al-Qaeda. In its early days, it was working with ISIS, but then there was a major split between Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And the Turkestan Islamic Party is made up of Uyghur Muslims from China who want to create what they call East Turkestan. And what's so wild is you'll see so many media outlets and liberal activists and NGOs, they'll use that term East Turkestan, which is a separatist term used by Salafi jihadist extremists who want to create a separate, they're secessionists who want to break off Xinjiang of China and create an Islamic state and rule it under, I mean, it's not going to exactly be the same as ISIS, but it's going to be like a Taliban style regime. So it's so hilarious. Speaking of the Taliban, the U.S. has also been bombing Uyghur extremist groups that have been fighting in Afghanistan in alliance with the Taliban.
Yeah.
So while the U.S. is bombing Uyghur extremists in Afghanistan, and as Uyghur Al-Qaeda supporters in Syria are trying to create an Islamic State, the U.S. is supporting these same separatist groups in China. Why? Because it's the same goal that all empires have tried. The British Empire did this, many European empires. It's balkanization. It's carving up China, divide and conquer. They want to carve off Tibet. That's been one of their goals since the triumph of the Chinese Revolution in 1949. Immediately in the 1950s, the CIA began activating a lot of assets, including the Dalai Lama, who has been on CIA payroll for decades.
Yeah.
The CIA was funding Tibetan separatists with millions of dollars for decades. And then now it's the same thing in Xinjiang. The goal is separatism. The goal is to carve up China, have China with internal problems within its borders so it can't focus on issues outside of its borders, and then eventually just carve it up. And you'll see maps that people are sharing on Twitter, and they say that the real China is this little slice here, and we're going to carve up these maps, carve up the map and make these new regions of China. I mean, it's really brazen. It's neocolonialism.
Yeah. And it's kind of funny because a lot of people don't understand the roots of the Uyghurs too as well, dating back to Operation Mongoose, where these Uyghurs were the actual Uyghurs that took the Stinger missiles into Afghanistan to aid the Mujahideen. And that form of radicalism also has roots back to the CIA, which people don't even talk about. And also another fact that a lot of these Uyghurs that are going to these, whatever you call re-education camps, a lot of their leaders want them to do that because they want them to learn the language so they can plug in economically to Beijing and make that money and fund a lot of their people. And a lot of people don't understand the roots and what's actually going on there. But let's talk about another hot pocket, because that Xinjiang, they want to carve that up, put that aside. Hong Kong, baby. They've been messing around there for a while, but finally they just arrested Jimmy Lai. I mean, this guy could have been arrested a long time ago. Yeah. Tell the people who this man Jimmy Lai is and why Americans should care. And more importantly, what's going to happen with Hong Kong moving forward? Now that kind of the West is like moving out of there, they're arresting some of the people who are tied to these NGOs. What's it going to be like in Hong Kong moving forward?
Well, obviously Jimmy Lai is a freedom fighter. Clearly, I mean, everyone told me he's a freedom fighter who loves democracy. No, Jimmy Lai is like the Jeff Bezos of Hong Kong, but honestly, even worse. He is a billionaire, super rich capitalist oligarch. He's extremely right wing, more right wing than Jeff Bezos, who's a liberal. But Jimmy Lai is very close to the Republican Party. He has had many meetings with the Trump administration, directly with the White House. So there are photos that he himself shared on social media. You can see him meeting with Pence and
Bolton.
Pompeo. He also met with John Bolton.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, one of the most just evil gargoyles on earth, who's now like part of the great liberal resistance. Yay. Yeah. This guy who got him
right?
drenched in blood. And so Jimmy Lai also is the owner of a major right-wing media outlet called Apple Daily, which is an opposition mouthpiece. It's one of the main vehicles representing the kind of perspective of the pro-Western, anti-Chinese wing of the Hong Kong oligarchs, because there's an oligarchy in Hong Kong which has a neoliberal economy because of the British. Because we have to keep in mind, within our lifetimes, I mean, we were all alive when Hong Kong was still a British colony. It wasn't until 1997 when Hong Kong was actually turned over to the PRC. It was a British colony, and the plan that the British wanted, this wasn't the Chinese government's plan. The British government they had negotiations and they settled on this plan of one country, two systems. Hong Kong has a neoliberal capitalist model. China has this very state-centered model of development, which is geared around state ownership of the commanding heights of the economy. And then there's private ownership of businesses and things like that, which, some of them are independent of the state. Some of them work with the state. Hong Kong is totally a dog-eat-dog capitalist neoliberal model. And so there's an oligarchy in Hong Kong that controls the segment of the country, the region, the autonomous region, and there are oligarchs who are pro-Beijing, and then there are oligarchs who are pro-Western. Jimmy Lai is the pro-Western oligarch, and we also need to keep in mind that not only is his economic policy right wing and his foreign policy right wing, he has some very extreme views when it comes to the mainland Chinese, who are the majority of the PRC. And we see that with the xenophobic campaigns that Jimmy Lai has been leading against mainlander Chinese. And we have to keep in mind the historical context. Because Hong Kong was a British colony and it was a major financial hub, for the majority of the modern history of China, Hong Kong was a very rich region, and people there were much more elite with more money. And the PRC, the mainland China, was very poor because it was colonized by a series of countries, mostly European countries, but also Japan, in a brutal genocidal campaign in the 19th and 20th centuries. After the triumph of the Chinese Revolution, there was a major increase, the largest increase in world history, of wealth in China, lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, which, by the way, you can't mention that the Chinese government has lifted 800 million people out of poverty. I mean, it's unfathomable, but you can't even mention that fact.
Yeah.
And so anyway, the point is that mainland China was much more poor for modern history, and Hong Kongers. I'm not saying all Hong Kongers, but the elite, rich Hong Kongers, there's a kind of a chauvinism, even kind of a racism against mainland Chinese. They have a kind of different ethnic, cultural background, but they're still part of the same country. And the point is that Jimmy Lai has been part of this nativist bent. They call themselves nativists, which is really just a nice term, euphemism for right-wing xenophobes, and frankly racist. In the context of China, they're racists, and they've portrayed mainlander Chinese as locusts. And you can see that he published an ad in his media outlet, Apple Daily, comparing mainland Chinese to locusts, there's this plague and they're going to take over Hong Kong. So this is a very extreme figure. And the fact that he's just portrayed as some kind of freedom fighter, I mean, it reminds me of when these same media outlets did so many reports just praising the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, and they call them the great freedom fighters. And then, of course, they called the fascist death squads, the Contras here in Nicaragua. Famously, Ronald Reagan called them the modern equivalent of the founding fathers. And Margaret Thatcher went to a Mujahideen camp in Afghanistan and referred to them as freedom fighters. And the media all said freedom fighters. I mean, it's just pure propaganda. It's insane.
What about the goons, though? Just really quick, I just want to follow up with what's his name, Nathan Law and Josh Wong and those little freaking goons that have been working with the NED, also coming out, the ones that really kind of led the riots or the protests and whatnot. Are those little goons going to be rounded up soon and taken some? Because I'm done with those guys.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what's going to happen to them, but what's pretty incredible is that you can see that this movement, this so-called movement that was totally astroturfed, I mean, it's a classic example of astroturfing, really just kind of disappeared overnight with the passage of the national security law. Yep. And we're supposed to believe that that's because China's so authoritarian. Well, it's incredible to see that this so-called authoritarian country has been allowing for years Western government-funded operatives lead a secession campaign. I mean, can you imagine? Think about it for a second. If China and Russia were funding California separatists, and there was a mass movement with millions of Californians on the street waging what's an insurgency, a low-scale war. I mean, it's not a guerrilla war, but it's like the level below that, where they're blowing people up where they're setting people on fire, where they're shooting people, they're using Molotov cocktails. There was, in fact, a report in the South China Morning Post, which is, by the way, a pro Hong Kong so-called democracy movement newspaper. This is not a mouthpiece of Beijing. And the SCMP, this media outlet, which is pro-protest, they reported that there were thousands of bombs that were found in a university that was taken over by the students, using the same kind of tactics that they used here in Nicaragua, where the extreme coup-mongering elements who are very violent will take over institutions like universities and then use them as kind of bases to wage an insurgency. And so that's what they've been doing for years. And China essentially was allowing it to operate. And then until now, they said, we're going to put our foot down. We're not going to allow this anymore. And they kicked out the National Endowment for Democracy, which is a CIA cutout created by Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. And basically overnight, all of these groups just disappeared and just died down because they were totally astroturfed, funded with many millions of dollars by the US and also the British government, other European governments. The European Union plays a role in this as well. And they're totally, it's again, we need to understand more how astroturfing works, because they do it in the US, by the way, to co-opt movements and uprisings in the US to make them all, vote for Biden. I mean, people went from talking about mass state violence in the US and taking money out of the police and taking money out of the military. And then 2 weeks later, they're like, yeah, we have to vote for Joe Biden. So, I mean, these astroturfing campaigns are not just in Hong Kong, but Hong Kong it's very clear because these so-called pro-democracy leaders, they're frankly not very bright. And they just go on Twitter and they wish happy birthday to Marco Rubio, as Joshua Wong did, and say, I love you, Marco Rubio. And then they go out and they wave American flags and sing the U.S. national anthem. And also, even worse, a lot of these people are the so-called pro-democracy forces, which are separatists. I mean, not all of them, but many of them are the most vocal Western government-backed forces are the separatists. The even worse optics than the U.S. flag is they're using the British colonial flag. And it's like, come on. These are people who are like 22 years old. They don't even remember. They never lived under British colonialism, and they're waving the British colonial flag. And it's like, dude, you really just want to be a British colony again.
Yeah. Right. So a lot of people get confused in relation to China as to what it is ideologically and what it is economically. Can you explain, is China communist? Because they do use a lot of, their economic system involves a lot of capitalism. Like you said, they lifted millions of people out of poverty. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, 800 million according to the World Bank. And let's keep in mind, the World Bank is a total U.S. instrument for neoliberal imposition of austerity measures and structural adjustment policies. And even the World Bank has acknowledged that China has seen the largest, what it calls the economic miracle, which is not a miracle. It's actually, because calling it a miracle ignores what the policy was. The policy was state-guided development of the economy. So China has a mixed economy. I'm not one of those people. I'm not going to say that China, it's certainly not what it was in the days of Mao, right? They've liberalized large parts of the economy, but this is very important. China does not have a neoliberal economic model like was imposed on the rest of the world after the destruction of the Eastern Bloc, when there was an attempt at a counter-revolution, an attempt to overthrowing the Communist Party of China and implementing a neoliberal model, which also would have likely led to the carving up and balkanization of China. And that's referred to as the Tiananmen movement, right? So there was this movement where pretty explicitly there were Western-backed elements that wanted to overthrow the Communist Party of China and do what they did to Russia, to the Soviet Union and then Russia. They imposed what was referred to at the time as shock therapy, mass neoliberal shock therapy, privatizing everything that led to these large oligarchs. And they wanted to do that to China. They were never successful because the Communist Party of China remained in control. But there are internal conflicts that go on. There's a lot of political debates that go on within the Communist Party of China. And there was the right wing of the party that were the more pro a kind of developmental model that still maintains state control but uses elements of privatization and a mixed economy, which were the kind of Deng Xiaoping elements. And there was a fight going on. Xi Jinping, the current president, comes. What's funny is the New York Times they always have these like Cold War zombies, these vampires who will never die, who are like 800 years old and who like were friends with Dulles and the founders of the CIA, and they'll write these op-eds in the New York Times about what they call the red bureaucracy and the Red Guard and the Old Guard and the Chinese Communist Party. And so she comes out of a particular wing of the party that is more on the left of the party. And so anyway, the point is that there's a conflict going on, and the Chinese government still has the Communist Party is very large. It's like 10% of the population. So there's a lot of divisions going on. But the point is that they never had mass neoliberal privatization in that same way. In terms of the GDP of the Chinese economy, the commanding heights, which it's a term that used to be used more in economics, which refer to like the banks, the most important thing. The banks are not privatized. The banks are still under the control of the state. Large infrastructure, the main infrastructure companies that are building the roads, the railways are under the control of the state. Many other parts of infrastructure, electricity, things like that, health, etc. So the large parts of the most important parts of the economy remain under state control. And then there are other parts that are kind of guided by the state in this kind of mixed model. And there's a fight going on. And I think that there are definitely a lot of people in China who have complaints with some of the privatization because it has led to a mass growth of the economy, but it's also led to inequality. So now that what's happening is that there's a fight going on with the Communist Party of China because the Deng Xiaoping, who came into power after the death of Mao Zedong in 1978. Mao died in 76, and 78, Deng comes in. And there's a fight going on ideologically. And the argument made by his faction is that we are a very poor country, which is true, and that we're still a largely feudal country with most people in the countryside, large parts of the country not developed. So in order to bring about socialism, we have to develop the productive forces of our economy, which means that we have to go through a period of capitalist development in order to eventually move to the road of socialism. That's a more traditional Marxist understanding going back to Marx himself. So essentially, that was the argument made by the Communist Party of China. And they've gotten to the point where they have the second largest, or probably, it's probably the largest economy on earth. So now there are elements of the Communist Party of China saying that we need to move back toward a more socialist model. And we'll see what happens. I think she clearly falls on that side of the split. But the point is, again, just to stress this point, is that that for the U.S. and these Western capitalist countries, China is still not capitalist enough. It's still a mixed economy with large state control. They want it to be a total capitalist neoliberal country, and they want to divide it up like they did to Russia. And that's why what's so funny is if you listen to Pompeo and all these people, they're like China is Marxist-Leninist and China is communist, because the government still maintains that ideological framework. And there's a very real possibility that they actually will go back toward more of those socialist policies. So the idea that China it's so funny hearing these people say that like China is more capitalist than the West. That's absolutely insane, because the West, first of all, most Western economies are based on a financial economy. It's imaginary, fictitious capital. They're not productive economies. The Chinese economy is based on production. China produces goods for the entire world. I live in Nicaragua. There are a lot of goods here in Nicaragua, which is a poor country in Central America. There are so many goods here that are made in China. So China is a massive powerhouse in terms of production. So in terms of the commanding heights of the economy, like especially the financial sector, that's still under state control. So there's so many misconceptions, but I would highly recommend, I think someone who really understands the kind of the economics behind that. There are a lot of people and there's some interesting. I mean, there's a lot of, especially stuff in India. There are these economists called the Patnaiks who are really good. But in terms of U.S., very like a simplistic kind of getting an understanding of the Chinese strategy, I would recommend Richard Wolff. Richard Wolff has the Economic Update, a regular show on YouTube and a podcast, and he really can, in simplistic terms, can kind of explain the Chinese model and why it's not like this. What's so funny is all these Western propagandists are like, they want to demonize China as some evil communist dictatorship, while at the same time trying to take credit, saying, well, the only reason it lifted 800 million people out of poverty is because of capitalism.
Right.
But meanwhile, here in Latin America, most of the countries are capitalist, and they've been capitalist for decades. And not only are they not lifting people out of poverty, poverty is rising. So if capitalism lifted 800 million Chinese out of poverty, why isn't capitalism lifting hundreds of millions of Indians out of poverty? Because India is still suffering from extreme poverty.
Yeah. And I think that when you said that when you talk about the buzzwords in that speech that Pompeo had in the Nixon Library, he made it a point to keep on nailing communist China, communist China, communist. It's like, they're bringing the buzzwords back. And then you hear all these people who are just really, I don't even think they have an understanding. You know, my mom, I love her, but when she goes, well, you can't, communist countries are terrible. It's like this kind of like American exceptionalism. And they're over here, we're over there. And they're kind of using these buzzwords to divide when people really don't even understand what communism is. They just put the bad stamp on it. But let's also talk about the sanctions.
Well, one quick note. I swear I won't rant on this, but the thing, I mean, whenever I get started on these topics, I mean, there's just so much to address. But the thing about that, what's interesting, I did an interview recently with my colleague Max Blumenthal, and we spoke with the economist Michael Hudson, another brilliant economist who can really describe this in simplistic terms. His analysis of China is really eye-opening. Michael Hudson made a really good point, and this is so ironic, is that the more that the U.S. empire overextends itself and really pushes aggressively these policies and pushes the policy of economic decoupling, ironically, they're actually helping the left wing of the Communist Party of China, because the argument made by the right wing, you could call the right wing of the Communist Party of China, was that we have to integrate with elements of Western capital to develop our economy. We need to work with these Western corporations to develop our economy, even though, by the way, they always did it on their own terms. So it's true that a lot of Western corporations were using Chinese labor, but it was done in a way that was defined on the Chinese government's terms, not in the way that in Latin America or other parts of Asia, where Western corporations determine the policy and the U.S. government determines the policy, like in Haiti or El Salvador now under the neoliberal government. But anyway, the point is that in China, there's this fight going on ideologically, and the wing of the party that made that argument in support of integration with the West, they're now losing the argument because the people in the U.S. government and some European governments are full on board saying we have to overthrow China. China is communist. That's actually empowering the elements in the Communist Party of China who are saying we should actually decouple our economy from the West and have more state control and clamp down more on the billionaires. So, I mean, the more that the U.S. fuels the Cold War, the more they're actually helping their own adversary.
Yeah. Two of those people are Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz, right? They're two of the 11 people who got sanctioned. Can you explain a little bit behind these sanctions to these individuals? What does that mean exactly, and why the Chinese did this?
Well, we need to keep always in mind, which is something that's not emphasized, like always in the media, because context is bad. I mean, if you provide context, you might be called a propagandist for the Chinese Communist Party. But the context is that all of these actions by China are proportional actions done directly in response to U.S. actions. Why did China choose 11 people? Because the U.S. sanctioned 11 Chinese officials. So at every single stage here, the Chinese government is saying very clearly, we are not going to allow the U.S. government to intimidate us. We're not going to allow them to do what they did to Libya, to do what they did to Syria. I mean, Syria survived, but at what cost, right? So the Chinese government is saying, look, you sanction us, we'll sanction you.
Yeah.
And that's what they've done with Huawei.
Embassy.
That's what they've done. And it's always proportional. And why did they choose these 11 people? Because these are people who are at the forefront of the clear new Cold War in China. Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, I mean, these insane neoconservatives. They also sanctioned the head of the NED, who, I mean, this is basically a CIA asset. And the NED, is a CIA cutout created by the Ronald Reagan administration to do what the CIA did during the Cold War, but to do it in the open now. And they also sanctioned, I think, the National Republican Institute, I believe, was one of them, which is another, basically an arm of the CIA that funds these international so-called opposition, so-called pro-democracy groups. So just as when China, it closed offices of Western media outlets and it canceled the visas for Western propagandist, so-called journalists, they did that in response proportionately to when the U.S. clamped down on Chinese media.
So we mentioned American exceptionalism, and it's this idea that America has a right to spread democracy across the world. It's very heavily influenced by the Monroe Doctrine, Manifest Destiny, the way this whole nation was founded from the start. A lot of progressives, though, what I've noticed in covering both electoral politics and foreign policy, don't care about foreign policy. They don't care about our civil liberties, especially people on the left that you would think that that's something that you would care about: freedom of speech, the ability to inform people against the propaganda machine. So how do we get these people who are on the left, who consider themselves democratic socialists, to start paying attention to these issues that, they seem to toss aside, as what Pasta says, the side dish is foreign policy, the main dish is Medicare for all, Green New Deal. How does that tie in, and how do we get people to actually pay attention to it?
Well, first of all, I'll say that we have to acknowledge that it's an uphill battle. It's extremely important, but the deal that the U.S. government has essentially made with the left since the Bolshevik Revolution is that it will allow a degree of kind of progressive reform, social democratic policies, as long as you don't use the I word. You can't talk about imperialism, because if you understand how capitalism functions as a system, capitalism does not function inside a nation. Imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism. It's the stage of capitalism in the monopoly stage we're in, of monopoly capital, where the imperial powers, they basically carved up the world, and then it becomes there's a period of European colonization. The Spanish, the Portuguese colonized the Americas, the French colonized part of Africa and the Middle East, etc. And then it gets to a point where then when they've colonized basically everything and it becomes, and they've implemented capitalism everywhere and overthrown feudal relations and created capitalist systems, and then it becomes a fight within different empires. It becomes imperialism is the way that capitalism functions in the international stage. And especially these days, I mean, that was already clear 100 years ago when the most famous texts on imperialism were being written, but in World War I, World War II. But now, I mean, it's just so insane, because as imperialism has become totally undeniable, it's under the name of globalization. There's even less discussion of it now on the left than there was 100 years ago. Because, I mean, capitalism is totally indistinguishable from imperialism at this point. Where is the majority of production done for the U.S. economy? It's not done in the U.S. It's done in the global South. Yeah. And as I said earlier, the U.S. economy is largely a financial and service-based economy, and production has been outsourced to the global South. So imperialism is the way that is the system by which capital maintains this global hierarchy. So if you're truly anti-capitalist, you have to understand that, okay, fine, we can have redistributive policies in the U.S., which of course I support. Of course we should absolutely expropriate the wealth of these billionaires. No one should be a billionaire. That's insane. Of course we should tax the rich. Of course we should have these policies. But by the way, that's not going to change the fact that our clothes are made in sweatshops in Bangladesh and Cambodia, right? And that there's still imperialism is the way that maintains that, okay, Europe can have its social democratic policies because the bulk of the economy, of the productive economy, is still predicated on super exploitation of workers in the third world. So that's part of the argument. And that's an argument that needs to be made at an ideological level and even at a moral level. And it's like, look, if you say that you're against exploitation of workers, that needs to extend outside of the U.S. borders. It needs to extend to the other 95% of the U.S. population. And then there's also the element of, I said that there was a kind of agreement made, especially during the Cold War, where, the U.S. capitalist class and the European capitalist class, especially in France and Italy, were really afraid of a socialist revolution and of communists taking power, including in a democratic election, because after World War II, of course, during World War II, the communists were the main resistance against fascism in France and Italy and everywhere. And in France, the Communist Party of France, and in Italy, the Italian Communist Party were extremely popular and had huge followings, especially in the labor movement. And they likely would have won free and fair elections if the elections were free and fair, which they were not. They were rigged by the CIA. They were rigged by French intelligence. In fact, the first operation the CIA ever did was rigging the 1948 Italian election. But anyway, the point is that, so we have to understand that if you're a socialist, you really have to understand that the policies that you're advocating for are only, if they're only allowed insofar as the government is afraid that they want to give the crumbs to the workers to prevent a socialist revolution. So yeah, you can have, maybe you can get like a tax rebate, or maybe if they're feeling really generous, i.e. if they're really scared of a revolution, they'll give us free public college or something, right? And that was the deal, especially made with European social democracies, is that,
Right.
We'll give you these policies. So there's also that argument that we really need to understand that we need to interrogate the entire system as a whole. Social democracy is not going to cut it, not only because of the exploitation of workers in the global South, but also because they'll give us a few handouts, they'll give us a few reforms, but still they're going to maintain the system in which the rich are still rich and the majority of the population, 90% of people, are still working class and are still, maybe they'll have the bare necessities, but are not doing nearly as well. And then there's finally the other argument, which is a more cynical argument, but it's true, and it's a short-term argument. But then there's the fact that even if all you care about, even if you don't care about workers in the global South, you don't care about having a socialist revolution, you don't care about actually having an equitable society without elite capitalists who maintain control over large parts of the economy. Even if you don't care about those two things, there's also the fact that even if you care about if you only want these social democratic policies like Medicare for all or the Green New Deal, the only way that you can fund them is by taking money from other programs, especially the U.S. military.
Yeah.
And the U.S. military is the largest institutional consumer of oil on Earth, which is, by the way, never mentioned in AOC's proposal for a Green New Deal.
Yeah, I was just
Naomi
going to
Klein
say,
never mentions it.
The AOCs and the Ilhan Omars are now praising Nancy Pelosi and getting endorsed by her. So it just seems like the whole idea that changing the Democratic Party is just a dead end, because these people come in there and they capitulate to the establishment over and over again. And, if you're not cheerleading them, and if you're not crazy and worshiping these new politicians, then you're not being supportive, you're not being progressive enough. And so really, I think the left in America, the very tiny left that we have, which is almost non-existent, really has to understand that you can't just dismiss imperialism, because that's what they're doing. And they're pushing Green New Deal, pushing Medicare for all, but they're not even getting that. And then in turn, they're having a very warmongering type of foreign policy.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Even in particular,
and if we get a Green New Deal, by the way, it's going to be a Green New Deal written by parts of the oligarchy, right? So
Right.
mining.com, I support the idea of a Green New Deal. By the way, that was originally proposed by the Green Party, and it was a much more progressive, radical proposal. And if you look at the current Green New Deal, mining.com is very in support of the current Green New Deal model, because they recognize that it would be a huge boon for the mining industry. There are other industries that are very much on board, and even parts of the fossil fuel industry, because the fossil fuel industry is diversifying. They can read where the cards are. They see that the future is going to be more of a mix of renewable energy and fossil fuels. So these big gas and oil companies are actually increasingly, diversifying their investments and investing in wind and solar.
Yeah. I was going to just say, too, when you were talking about like the imperialism and everything when it comes to our own government, they really do stink across the board. I mean, we have no left. I mean, it's particularly when it comes to Hong Kong and China. I mean, the Hong Kong Freedom and Democracy Act is, the NED board is all over it. And meanwhile, you got Ro Khanna and Ayanna Pressley, who are supposed to be progressives on, as co-signers on this bill. And it's just a sad state of affairs when it comes to, our foreign policy across the board. That's why, I supported Tulsi because of that reason, because she was the best on that. But these people even stunk when it came to Venezuela as well. I mean, so it is scary. Really
let's not forget that AOC, but by the way,
deferred to the Leaders Caucus leadership. You're going to mention that?
Oh, yeah. Well, but I was going to say, MSNBC loves her. What's incredible is that MSNBC doesn't like Ilhan Omar. So, that's some cred to Ilhan Omar. She's definitely got issues, but parts of the liberal media hate Ilhan Omar, but they love AOC, man. She's really a message. And a quick note on this is that this is why when people talk about astroturfing is really important to understand astroturfing, because the point is that this is dialectical, right? There's a process going on here where the Democratic Party recognizes that in order to exist in the future, it's basically dead. It has to give some red meat to the progressives. So they're going to meet the AOC types maybe like a quarter of the way where they want to be met. And they'll throw out a few things, and eventually what happens is that these progressive leaders, they drink the Kool-Aid, they buy in, and they become part of that same exact system. So it's not necessarily even that, look, I don't know what the word sellout means, but I don't even know if I would necessarily call them sellouts, because I think they think they're doing the principled thing, and they think that they're smart enough to game the system in the long run. But in the long run, they just become part of it. It's not a matter of even selling out. They become the new Nancy Pelosi's.
It's a co-option of sorts, co-opting of the progressive.
But it's mutual, is my point.
Yeah, but I don't buy that, because AOC's number one job, we put her there, was to fight against the establishment. We wanted what should I say, like almost like a mirror image of what the Freedom Caucus did to the Republicans on the right. They made Boehner cry. They threw Cantor out of office. We wanted the same thing on the left. We wanted somebody big to go. And I'm not just talking about who AOC bought and whatever his name, what's his name again? Joe Crowley. We wanted to see somebody of real significance gone. We wanted them to oppose them, especially on foreign policy. They didn't do it. To begin with. They joined them. So I got to say that the left's progressive movement did not mirror what happened on the right. I mean, for Christ's sakes, Donald Trump is like a Tea Party member of sorts, and now he's in the White House. Why didn't the left do the same thing? Why was the left able to co-opt the progressives when the right wasn't able to do that to their own Tea Party members who were so against the establishment when they came in?
Well, because the Democratic Party is not a left-wing party. And, Republicans are really dumb. But this talking point that is so stupid about, the Democrats were the party of slavery. I mean, when Republicans are using that, it's an extremely dumb argument. But there's an argument to be made using that same talking point from the left. The Democratic Party has never had a history of being a left-wing party. There was the moment of, FDR kind of social democracy, but that wasn't a product of the Democratic Party. That was a response to the global material conditions of the Soviet Union, socialist revolution around the world. I mean, we have to understand the context. And this gets also back to this whole idea of foreign policy, because it's so wild to me. In other countries, there's not this idea of foreign policy being independent from domestic policy. That is a very U.S. thing. That is very much an American exceptionalist framework of understanding the world, because other countries see themselves as part of a planet. In the U.S., we're not on planet Earth. It's the U.S. and then there's the rest of them. In other countries, politicians are like, their domestic policy is related to their international policy. And what's so wild is that in the US, this is a country with less than 5% of the global population. The other 95% of the population is just seen as it's just another issue on the bottom of a list that we call foreign policy.
Yeah. That's Ben Norton's got jokes over here. A planet. I love that stuff. Really quickly, just with the TikTok stuff so we can get on to the next subject. Is it really bad that they're being forced to be sold to a Western company, but was it really bad if they obtained the data? I mean, I don't see somebody sitting in Beijing going, Ben Norton likes to put on a hat and say, singing in the rain. We got his data now. I mean, was it really bad? Is this just a publicity stunt by Trump to kind of drum up some support?
What about Google? What about Facebook?
I mean, Google and Facebook, I mean, Facebook sold our information. Well, they said it was a security breach, but they gave it to Cambridge Analytica. You know what I'm saying? They gave all our whole data, our digital footprint to this other company. Is it really bad that they have our data in TikTok? I mean, what can they do with it?
No, exactly. No, I only want U.S. corporations to give me like the most insanely specific targeted ads based on something I talked about with my friends 2 hours ago. No, yes. Only like after talking. Like for the first time ever in my life, mentioning like gourmet pizza somehow on Instagram, I get, it's just a coincidence that an hour later I received like 50 ads for gourmet pizza. I mean, it's talk about peak hypocrisy. It's really wild. Of course, I think there are two threads to respond to with this issue, right? There's one is the element of corporate power, which is of course related to the second, which is the U.S. kind of imperial strategy, the grand strategy. So in terms of corporate power, I mean, Trump is helping U.S. companies buy up their Chinese competition. So there's that, strictly business element. So now Microsoft is going to become the owner of the U.S.-based operations that are currently overseen by the Chinese company that owns TikTok. So that's just a classic example of what's essentially protectionism. Trump is looking out for U.S. corporations and helping them buy up their competitors. So that is just, it's so blatant. I mean, the fact that Microsoft was in talks with this, I mean, it's really obvious. But then there's the imperial grand strategy element, which is Yasha Levine, one of my favorite journalists. Everyone should check out his work. He has a brilliant book called Surveillance Valley, and he talks about the history of the origins of the internet and all of these big tech companies, and he shows how Google, Facebook, all these big tech corporations are contractors with the U.S. military.
Yep.
Google, for instance, has a contract with the CIA. Yep. Google helped carry out map technology with the U.S. military in the Iraq War. Google also helps police agencies in the U.S., many police agencies, spy on their population. Google launched a spy drone and a spy satellite with U.S. police. So all of these companies they're part and parcel. They're integrated into the U.S. state.
Absolutely.
The thing about the U.S. state is that the U.S. is just like this dystopian hellscape where it's like everything is a public-private partnership. Every so-called U.S. government agency is like a so-called independent agency that's funded by the U.S. government, but that's run independently. So like technically USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development, and technically the NED, the National Endowment for Democracy, technically they're independent in scare quotes. They're arms of the U.S. government, but they're like partially privatized. And that's true for so many U.S. government agencies because it's like, this is the illogical end to neoliberalism, which is just capitalism in its most brutal, raw form, where you're privatizing everything. And I mean, I guess Chile is the other example where water is privatized. But I mean, that's really what the U.S. is. So when you look at all these companies, they're basically arms of the U.S. government, even though they're technically private. It doesn't matter because technically the NED is private, but no one's pretending like the NED's, or some propagandists will pretend that it's independent. So I think that part of it is also the U.S. government recognizes that these non-U.S. social media platforms, it's not controlled by the U.S. government, and they want total control. So this is actually why this gets back to the first question you asked me about China being authoritarian. China recognized, because again, China saw the very real threat of a counter-revolution with Tiananmen, with the NED groups and things like that. China recognized that for its own domestic economy, but also for the longevity of its own political system, it had to create independent institutions that are not controlled by the US government. The US government is the largest empire in history, not just with the military, which has 800 military bases, but even more insidiously, 2 billion people use Facebook. How many millions of people, potentially a billion, I don't know how many, use Twitter and WhatsApp? WhatsApp is owned by Facebook. Instagram is owned by Facebook. YouTube is owned by Google. How many billions of people use these technologies? And not even just that. So these people are basically, all of their information, the US government has access to at all times. People around the world. So there's also the US technological empire, not just the US military empire. We saw this recent report in the Wall Street Journal that a US military intelligence cutout, once again, a great example of the privatization of what's basically a US government institution, has been spying on hundreds of millions of phones around the world, tracking their locations. And they have their tracking and other technology, spy technology, in more than 500 apps. So the reason, I mean, again, to simplify the points I just made, this is helping US companies buy up their Chinese competition, and it's helping the US government maintain its chokehold over technology so it can spy on the entire planet.
Right. And so just really quickly, we wanted to touch on Belarus because of what recently happened. Western influences seem to be pushing a coup in Belarus, and you had a really great thread on it, to oust one of the last Soviet leaders. So what's the evidence that the U.S. is behind this, and why?
I mean, it's pretty clear today, especially. I mean, I've been tweeting about it and spelling some of it out, but in the past several hours, Joe Biden released a statement endorsing the democracy movement in Belarus. There you go. I mean, it can't get any more blatant than that. We saw John Bolton is tweeting about the pro-democracy movement in Belarus. It's just so obvious.
Yeah.
The Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, which is a U.S. government propaganda outlet created by the CIA during the Cold War. They've been doing nonstop coverage of the so-called pro-democracy movement. And then all you have to do is look at some of the people who call themselves the leaders of this movement. And I mean, I showed on the Twitter thread, people can find all of the, the evidence there, the receipts there.
Yeah.
These are people,
we
one of the main guys who is like a so-called journalist who's also happens to be an activist who's both organizing and then publicizing these protests. Because think about how this works. Okay, if you're going to have like a color revolution protest, who's going to be the people who decides where they are? Well, it's these people who are like Western government assets who then go on their Twitter account and say, we're all going to meet here at this hour. Or as he said, activists told me that they're going to meet here at this hour. Yeah, who are those activists? I mean, so he's the one who decides where the protest is going to be. It's not going to be, it's not some Facebook event. It's him. And then he gets like 8,000 retweets because like 800 US politicians retweet him. And then everyone shows up for a mass protest and they all take their photos and their videos of them facing off with the police. And then all the Western propaganda media outlets will spread those videos and photos and say the Belarusian regime. I mean, it's been tried again and again. Ukraine is a great example. I mean, Maidan, it's the same model. Yeah. And this guy, I mean, but what's so funny is if you look at my Twitter thread, I look at some of these people.
Yeah.
One of these main guys who's the one who gets like 8,000 retweets and says, we're having our protest here. And this is a guy who his entire career has been working for US government propaganda outlets. And he also has some democracy promotion group based in Washington, D.C. And by the way, what is its partner listed at the bottom of the website? The U.S. State Department. They're not even hiding it effectively.
They don't.
And one other quick point here that I mentioned is that the main opposition candidate, who's a neoliberal, whose husband is like a YouTuber, and he became popular on YouTube doing all of these like anti-government videos that for some reason are really heavily promoted in the algorithm. All of our videos criticizing the U.S. government. I mean, wait, why don't we get the dissident bump in the algorithm? I want the dissident bump, but no, the foreign dissidents, not just him, but like in Russia, there was like this right-wing Koch brothers libertarian who was like this like 20-year-old who like in like 2 months became like a YouTube huge celebrity because he was boosted in the algorithm. I mean, come on, like this stuff, it just spells it all out. But anyway, the point is that this neoliberal candidate, I was going to mention that the Moscow Times, which is a pro-NATO pro-Western media outlet, they were talking about how there was this guy from DC who he worked in the Obama campaign, and he has been an advisor to numerous Russian, Georgian, and Ukrainian oligarch opposition candidates, pro-NATO candidates, and then he just gets whisked into Belarus to advise her.
Yeah. Really quick, the last question. We got to get out of here. We have a few things to do at another show coming up. But the situation in Belarus is a little bit more complex, Ben. I want to talk about that. A little bit different than the Ukrainian situation because Alexander Lukashenko has openly courted the West at times. Just in February, he had Pompeo over there talking about purchasing oil, trying to leverage his deal against Putin. And then the appointing of an American ambassador to Belarus in April, in Julie Fisher. And that particular role hadn't been filled in over a decade. And then the weird thing about it is because, Ukraine was kind of like there was a Western side, a Eastern side, which kind of favored Putin, whatnot. We had this, what some media outlets, some independent media outlets were calling fake, the arrest of 30 agitators who were supposed to be supporting a Russia coup of sorts. And Lukashenko has always kept Putin at a distance. He's been dragging his feet when they talked about making a union state. It's like to me that Lukashenko is playing three-dimensional chess here. So my question is, what do you think Lukashenko will be able to do moving forward if he's clearly keeping Putin at a distance, yet he has the West knocking on the door with these NGOs in his country threatening a regime change? Should we expect him to now maybe, since he's leveraged his whole situation, cut a deal with Putin and form a union state? Or will he just still continue to be this kind of like individual character that plays both sides? Will he be able to continue to do that?
We'll see. I think anyone looking at it soberly, especially people outside of the Anglosphere bubble of the media, will recognize that the only real option is integrating with an axis moving more east. And there's a larger axis that's growing. Iran just signed a major agreement, which didn't get enough attention, with China. And that's a military economic agreement in many ways. Of course, Pakistan is integrated more closely with China. And the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is becoming a huge global juggernaut in terms of integrating large parts of the global, not just economy, but the population. So, it's clear it's the only real option, especially if you're a neighbor right next to Russia, close to China, and also if NATO wants to eat you up and annex you. Look, I agree with you that he's playing 100% playing three-dimensional chess. And so, for instance, even the Belarusian government claimed they themselves, it wasn't just Western propaganda. They claimed that the Russians they arrested were supposedly spies who were going to destabilize the country. That was very clearly, it was him, sending a sign to NATO, the European Union, and the US that I'm going to try to play ball here. Don't overthrow me. Don't color revolution me.
Yeah, I know.
I'm trying to play a balancing act here. But at the same time, Russia knows that Belarus, it's not an option, because this is exactly what happened with Gaddafi, right? Gaddafi, he played a ball to an extent with the West, especially after after 9/11 and the so-called war on terror, where Gaddafi thought that maybe the West might be kind of serious for once after spending years supporting Islamist groups around, the Muslim Brotherhood was a long British intelligence asset and became an American intelligence asset. So and the Mujahideen, of course, after years of supporting these Islamist groups, maybe the U.S. might finally be serious about fighting Al-Qaeda and these other extremists. Of course, Gaddafi had recognized that the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, which was backed by the CIA and British intelligence, was close to Al-Qaeda. That was one of the main so-called opposition groups, one of his main threats. So he thought maybe that the West will try to help me fight extremist Islamist Salafi jihadist groups. Of course, we saw what happened.
Nope.
No, I mean, right? He actually agreed. And so did Syria. Syria and Libya agreed to participate in the CIA torture program of torturing some of these extremist Salafi jihadist forces. And by the way, Iran, people forget this, Iran kind of played ball at first with the war in Afghanistan, because the Taliban was a longtime enemy of Iran as well. Yeah. Iran is, of course, Shia, and the Taliban are hardline extreme Sunnis. Yeah. So there's a history of these. Look. If we look at history just in like the here and now with the nitty gritty details of like what's happening this month or even this year, sometimes we kind of lose the larger historical trajectory. There are always going to be these internal contradictions. You can go back to Nasser. Nasser was a great example. With the Suez crisis, it was actually the U.S. that took the side of Nasser in the Suez crisis, but then the U.S. also later played a key role in trying to destabilize Nasser. So we can kind of get caught up in the weeds, but if we look at the long-term historical trajectories, a lot of these leaders try to play three-dimensional chess and make some concessions and play Russia and NATO against each other, but he knows what side of his bread is buttered. Like he knows where. I
feel that way.
So I think that at the end of the day, it's pretty clear what's going to happen, and I don't want to make predictions, but the color revolution doesn't look like it's working out too well, and he's learned. He's looking at Ukraine. He looked at what happened in Ukraine.
Right? Huh? They called it the slipper revolution at first, I think. Moon Over Alabama had a great article about that, with the cockroach mentality and whatnot. So, I mean, Johnny, we have anything else before the super chats? Or Ben, you do some amazing work. I just want to say thank you for the super chat. Spectra is winning. And I think there was Neil Garrison who left a couple bucks too as well. Thank you for joining us. Freebird. That's why they propped the GND over Tulsi's OFT Act, the Green New Deal over OFT Act.
Sure.
Just some other stuff to talk about. Ben, you're doing some amazing work out there. We often share your tweets. We love your work, but obviously with Belarus and Hong Kong and China, we still got a lot more work to do.
Yeah.
So keep providing that information. Anything you want to tell us about the gray zone or anything new coming up?
Well, we have some exciting things coming up. I won't spoil them, but you can check out our work at thegrayzone.com. And in terms of anyone who's interested in these topics we're discussing today, I live in Latin America, and one of the next big countries people are talking about, the next on the list is Mexico. So people keep an eye out for Mexico. They're going to try to do what they did in Brazil to Mexico. But look, at the same time, people think that I'm very pessimistic. They think that I'm very defeatist, but I'm actually not, especially in this historical moment, because as much damage as the U.S. empire is doing around the world, it's losing power because it's overextending itself. And like I said earlier, the aggressive attacks are encouraging countries that normally, China actually being an example, China had a more conciliatory stance. It was trying. Deng Xiaoping famously said that we're going to lie low and bid time. And the U.S. just aggressive actions are forcing China to look elsewhere and to integrate more with other countries. So actually, I think we should be a little more optimistic that there are countries that are kind of slowly, but in the long term, I think they're going to be able to free themselves more from sanctions, from all of these other aggressive measures that essentially amount to a global dictatorship led by U.S. corporations. So there's a reason to be optimistic. And then in the U.S., it's hard to be optimistic in the U.S. because the political situation is so bad. But look, we're in a situation right now that's similar to the Great Depression, even potentially worse. And that for people who are on the left, people who are tired of the bipartisan dictatorship, there's a real possibility for revolutionary change. So I think we it was Gramsci who famously said, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. And I always have that optimism of the will. It's important to not lose hope.
Yeah. You better be careful in Nicaragua.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems like the U.S. is looking back to have beef with Daniel Ortega again. Like they haven't settled that shit yet. So be careful over there.
But they blew their wad in 2018. They can't do it again. They tried a very violent coup attempt, and it's another example of that. Unfortunately, for every time that it does succeed, as in Bolivia, it also fails. It's failed in Venezuela. It's failed in Nicaragua, and I think that we might see it fail even more because
I hope so.
People are waking up to what's actually happening, and they're not going to tolerate it anymore.
Well, thank you so much, Ben. We really appreciate it. Thank you for the conversation. We love to talk about imperialism, and let's hope more of us pay attention to that.
Yeah. We could talk to you for hours. We got to get out of here now. So for Pasta Jardula,
don't tempt
Fiorella.
me.
Jonny Sue on the ones and twos with Ben Norton from the Gray Zone.
See you guys later. Come out. Bye.